Hello everyone! In today's video, I continue with the Firebird Rift build by designing, printing, and beginning to install some drift missile-inspired modifications, and I continue to make progress on the 72 Chevy Prerunner build by completing the post-print finishing work on the bedside pieces, as well as coming up with a way of mounting them to the truck, and I begin wiring for the lights. Starting off with the 1/24 scale Firebird Rift project, this has been a build that I've showcased many times previously, showing the process of converting this monogram model car kit into a fully functional and highly detailed radio-controlled vehicle. As I discussed the last time I featured this project, with the electronics, drivetrain, and suspension designed, printed, installed, and the car functioning well, I'm beginning to move on to focusing more on the cosmetic aspects of the car. With that said, I did spend a chunk of time this past week messing around with the front suspension, trying to get it to move as smoothly as possible. The front suspension on this car is by far the most difficult part of this build. Due to the modified McPherson strut setup, this is very difficult to adjust and get to move smoothly, especially in this small scale, as well as the fact that the top part of the strut is connected to the body, rather than being as a part of the main chassis piece. Having the front suspension apart did give me a great opportunity to paint the wheel mounts to look more like brake rotors, just to add a little more detail. In addition, I also wanted to paint the springs. Although the painted springs are quite subtle, I really like the little bit of extra detail that they add to the car. Once all of the paint had dried, I reassembled the front suspension components. I also added a hole so that I could insert a screw to help support the motor, since as you may recall, while driving previously, the heat from the motor caused the plastic motor mounts to bend, and this was just a very simple solution that I figured would stop this from being an issue. These changes and adjustments to the front suspension certainly had a positive effect, although the front suspension is still not great. At this stage, I really don't want to invest any more time working on it. For now, it's good enough. I'll be using the second Firebird that I'm building as an opportunity to hopefully further improve upon this design. While I was waiting for some new parts to be printed and for the paint to dry, I wanted to begin working on some parts for the front and rear of the car. I decided that I do not want to install the factory front and rear bumper covers, and instead designed some parts that make it look like the bumpers along with the taillights have been removed, and I wanted to add a place to mount a bash bar onto the front. I showed the entire design process of these parts in a previously uploaded video, which I'll be sure to include a link to below in the description if you'd like a more in-depth look at the design process. But in short, the process to create these parts was quite easy and straightforward. I started by taking photos of both the front and rear of the car, and then taking some measurements of the openings. I then used this as a reference for designing the parts. Once finished with the design, I printed out all of the parts. I started by printing everything on an FDM printer so that I could do some mock-ups. Later, I printed out the front bash bar and rear bumper reinforcement piece on an SLA printer, which allow these parts to be printed with higher detail. I began to do some post-print finishing on all of the parts by trimming and sanding away any imperfections, as well as test fitting the parts and drilling out the holes. I determined that I would need to make some minor modifications to both the interior tub and the body in order for the rear panel to fit. I needed to remove both of these tabs that help align the body and the interior piece. Before doing so, I traced around the outer edge of the interior tub so that I would have a reference of exactly where it should be positioned. The rear panel can now fit exactly where it needs to be, though I needed to do some sanding around the outer edges. Next, I did a quick mock-up of the rear panel and bumper reinforcement. I noticed that I would need to make some modifications to the chassis. The first thing I would need to do is remove some of the material from the back edge, allowing the bumper reinforcement to not extend out too far. I also sanded this top section smooth to allow for a small piece of styrene to be glued over top of this opening. Although I'm already really starting to like the way this back section is looking, I want to continue to make some more modifications to the chassis, as well as possibly redesign the rear bumper reinforcement to be slightly larger and to not extend quite as far out. At this point it was getting quite late, so I decided to call it quits for the evening, but I'm looking forward to continuing with this build, and I'm especially excited to see how the bash bar looks when installed, and to see everything painted. Of course, I'll be showing all of that in a future video. So I've been continuing to make some progress on the Prerunner project. I uploaded a video several weeks back where I made some bedside pieces and did some work on the body and fender flares. I also installed some magnetic front body mounts, which I now needed to glue to the underside of the body. I used shoe glue as an adhesive and then simply pressed the body down and ensured that it was positioned correctly. Moving on to the front fender flares, as you may remember previously, I used acetone vapor to smooth the ABS plastic that these parts were printed in. I then applied several thick layers of primer to help further smooth out the surface. After allowing the primer plenty of time to dry, I began sanding the surface until it was smooth and ready for paint. Next, I moved on to smoothing the bedsides. These were printed in PLA, so using acetone like I did for the fender flares won't be very effective. A bit more labor was necessary in order to get these parts smooth and no longer looking like they had been 3D printed. I started by using some coarse grit sandpaper to begin smoothing the transition between all of the layers, especially on the top section, which is where the layering is most visible. With this initial sanding complete, I once again began layering thick coats of primer onto each part. After allowing plenty of dry time, I once again began sanding the entire surface. Already the bedsides were looking much better. I then began spreading some putty over sections where imperfections, layering, and holes were visible. Allowing the putty several hours to dry, I sanded the sections flush with the rest of the part. I repeated this process once more in a few spots that I thought needed some more work. At this point, the bedsides are looking great and feel very smooth. Unfortunately, I was out of primer, so I was unable to continue with priming the bedsides for paint. I was able to begin brainstorming some ways to mount the bedsides to the rest of the truck. I designed a mount that I will use to secure the rear section of the bedside piece, which will be held in place using a magnet. I plan to mount the front of each bedside piece to the back side of the cab. I will probably just use some styrene to fabricate the front mounts, but for these rear mounts, I used Fusion 360 to design them. I then printed each piece and test fit them to make sure they will fit. With the mounts looking like they will fit great, I begin sanding each piece and later layered on some thick coats of primer to give them a smooth surface. I also printed the light buckets for the front grille that I designed and printed previously. Next, I began working on the wiring for the lights that I'm adding. After a quick test to ensure that all of the electronics are functioning correctly, I began working on the wiring. I did not have any 5mm white LEDs on hand at the time for the headlights, so I'll be waiting to incorporate those. However, I wanted to get started by wiring the LEDs mounted on the roof rack to the truck. I started by soldering on a connector that will allow the wires that lead to the roof rack to be able to be disconnected for when I want to separate the body from the chassis. I will be using a small voltage booster to increase the voltage so that all the LEDs in the series will be illuminated. I go ahead and solder it to the connector. I only loosely soldered the roof rack wires since they will need to be disconnected before I mount the roof rack onto the roof of the truck. As long as the input voltage is within spec and is lower than the output voltage, the voltage coming out of the booster will be the same regardless of what voltage the battery is. Simply adjusting the potentiometer sets the output voltage. I test the circuit to ensure everything is looking good so far. To power all of the lights, I'll be splicing into the wires that lead from the battery to the truck. With the battery mount relocated to the front, I need to make an extension anyways, so I will incorporate wires that will power the lights into this extension. And once again, I make sure to test everything. I will be incorporating a switch into the circuit so that I will be able to turn the roof rack lights on and off independently of whether the battery is plugged in, and I'll probably add a resistor into the LED circuit for good measure. Here I used a zip tie to secure the battery wires so that they don't come into contact with the suspension components. And that is where I'm at right now with this project. I'm currently waiting on a few parts to arrive in the mail, and I'm also thinking about what kind of paint job I want for this truck. I haven't decided on anything yet, though I do have a few ideas. And to conclude today's video, I want to showcase some of the amazing vehicles and projects that have been showcased on the Make It RC Facebook group. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.